Hi everyone, hope you're all having a great week. So today I'm going to be presenting on this week's theme, which is Design's New Scale, and I'm going to be looking at the readings Moving to Mars and Metamorphosis. Almost got that right. So the first reading I'm going to be looking at is Metamorphosis, and that is by the writer Erlich Beck, and he passed away in January 2015. But he is a well-known German sociologist and one of the most cited social scientists in the world during his lifetime. He's written books and articles, and his work focuses on questions of ignorance and uncertainty in the modern age. So something very important and relevant to our reading is that he coined the term world risk society. So a world risk society, as he explains, is a society that's preoccupied with the future and its relation with risk. So it forces us to recognize that if we keep looking at the world from the current framework that we do, which is at a national perspective, we could ignore shared global risks like climate change, and we need to create a new frame of reference that can create a culture of responsibility for us all, so we all work together. And that's kind of what he talks about in his reading. So for us as designers, this is important because as we change the way we look at life through a world risk society, we also have to change our framework as designers and what we create for this rapidly changing society. So the article specifically focuses on 7 different theses of how climate change is currently changing the world, rather than our perspective that it's going to cause risk in the future. So his first thesis is that while our current focus, like I said, is how we can stop climate change from occurring, we're actually overlooking its current impact and how it changes the way we're living, and it actually is influencing politics. So the way our issues are currently framed is in the context of nation states. So there is a federal level that overlooks city states, and there are those in power that make decisions that impact people. But from the lens of climate change and a world risk society, there are those that create risks, but unlike the nation state perspective, they aren't accountable from the perspective of those affected by the risks. So it creates a whole different framework we should look at, which we aren't currently doing. His second thesis is where he defines the word of metamorphosis, which he titles the article, and basically it's related to the idea of transformation, but he chooses not to use that word because unlike transformation, metamorphosis is the idea that we're shifting our frame of reference. So transformation exists within the present and it's just things we can see objectively, while metamorphosis is changing our basically our worldview, which better applies to climate change. And he gives the examples of Hiroshima and the Holocaust, that during the time, things that like the Nazis did were seen as acceptable through the law, but afterwards we changed our very being in the world, as he says, to fit like the new frames of references that these events gave us, which is what climate change is currently doing. So I thought his third thesis was very interesting, and it's basically that this lens of this metamorphosis of climate change also changes the way we view class. So how class has been usually viewed as is through the distribution of goods. So there's people that have more money than others, people that are wealthy, people that aren't. But through this lens, there's a distribution of bads instead. So there's people who are more in risk than others, and there's people who are, like, for example, he talks about sea levels, which class of people is more affected by sea levels and which aren't. So it kind of eliminates this idea of like social inequalities and puts everybody on a whole different playing field. So his fourth and fifth theses go together, and basically he says that there's no national answers for these global problems, and that's what we're seeing as we view the world through a world risk society. So climate change is basically making a shift from a focus on national powers to an emphasis on cities with smaller populations, and we can see the direct results of local initiatives to combat climate change as opposed to national initiatives. So this basically decreases faith in the nation state and brings back a stronger faith in democracy, which he describes as a good thing. So in his sixth thesis, I was a little confused at first because he introduces the word, it's a German word, so I'm 100% pronouncing it wrong, but I'm going to try just for fun. Weltschrittgolkard, okay, never mind. But that's just the German name for his book, which is titled World Risk Society in English, and he just relates that to the idea of war. So these shared global risks like climate change create a new frame of reference for nations around the world and create a culture of responsibility. So rather than looking at your enemies with like a us-them opposition, we acknowledge them as partners because we have a common goal. So in other words, he says that climate change may be an antidote for war. So the first thing that came to mind as I read this is, what if there's people that just don't believe in climate change, which there are, and he addresses this in the seventh thesis, and he says So basically, there are two scenarios. People who deny climate change are wrong. We choose not to change the way we live, and then we all suffer. Or they're right, and then nothing happens, basically. But then he says the benefits of believing climate change to be true is that, as mentioned in the sixth thesis, creates cooperation patterns and just ultimately helps us, either way. So it just benefits everybody all around, and deniers would see that, or they're ultimately losers, like he says. So now I'm going to discuss the reading Moving to Mars, and we read the introduction and the essay titled Wilding of Mars. So the readings are part of a larger catalog titled Moving to Mars, designed for the Red Planet, and it's a book that explores the crucial role that design will play if humans travel and inhabit the planet Mars. One section that I thought was really interesting even addresses speculative design, and it's important in designing life for Mars, which was a section we didn't read, but I thought, like I said, was really interesting because we did discuss it in class. So I'll start with an overview of the introduction, and the author is Andrew Nahum, and this is the only image I could find of him. It was his profile picture on a website, and he's the curator of technology engineering at the Science Museum in London and one of the editors of this catalog, Moving to Mars. So I'm glad we read the introduction because we couldn't read the entire catalog, and he touches on all the key topics explored in the book. So first he starts talking about the idea of getting to Mars, and he talks about space activists like Robert Zubrin and Elon Musk's SpaceX program, and these are people who are advocating for Mars exploration. But then he also discusses space scientists that are more skeptical because of environmental challenges and settlement on the land could be very difficult. Because of this, current missions by NASA are more conservative and incremental, and they move a lot slower than a lot of space activists want them to, but for designers it is a lot easier to work with what we already know. But no matter the method we're using to begin our exploration to Mars, it's still going to need a very great energy supply, and a mission to land just 3 astronauts on the planet would need enough energy to power 15 to 30 homes, like he says in the reading. So this includes the energy required for travel, but also energy needed for occupation, and the image you're seeing now is a concept of nuclear reactors that NASA is developing to power human settlement on Mars. So there are ambitious ideas currently happening in terms of design. Then he goes on to discuss the ethics of moving to Mars and brings up astronomer Carl Sagan. And he says that if any life form exists on Mars, we shouldn't attempt to settle, no matter. It could be bacteria, actual sentient life form. We just shouldn't attempt to settle. Along the same line, others have argued that we've already colonized our Earth, and it would be unethical to ruin another planet because that's the direction Mars would be going if we were to colonize it. But what if there isn't any life on Mars? And that's where he brings up Alexandra Daisy Ginsburg, and she wrote the next section we read from this catalog, and I'll explain more in depth her argument when we get to her reading. So with these ethical reasons against moving to Mars, he also brings up people in support of it and their ethical reasons, and one of the people that have argued for settling Mars is Stephen Hawking, and he does that in terms of saving civilization. So he says our settlement on Mars is sort of insurance for humankind, and Elon Musk also echoes this, and he says if there's a huge war like World War III, we need to make sure that there's some sort of human civilization somewhere. So lastly, he talks about the design implications of traveling and living on Mars. So the moon trip lasted 8 days and already had a great impact on the mental health and psyche of the astronauts. But a trip to Mars would be a 7-month ride, and that's a major risk for psychological health. So there's a demand for design that's more focused on human needs in space due to obviously the length of the visit and also the surface of Mars itself. So the lack of atmospheric pressure, the extreme cold, the high cosmic and solar radiation, the scarcity of Earth-produced construction materials, which are all things we as designers need to accommodate for when we create these designs. And like he says, we need to make designs that are suitable for this environment, but also embody current earthly designs, just for the ethics of human mental health. So now let's look at the section The Wilding of Mars by Alexandra Daisy Ginsburg. So she's an artist that studies synthetic biology and the relationship between nature and technology, and she does this through artworks, writings, and larger products. So here's just a overview of the reading itself. So first she discusses how, despite early beliefs, growing scientific understanding has decreased our hopes of encountering life on Mars. But despite this, the idea of terraforming persists, and terraforming is basically transforming another planet's conditions to make it more like Earth, which would allow life from Earth to survive on that planet. And there's advocates for terraforming Mars because of Earth's climate breakdown, but she talks about how we talk about Earth's climate breakdown as a reason why we should terraform Mars, But that's kind of sidestepping our own responsibility, since humans are the ones causing this climate change and this pollution and this breakdown in biodiversity in Mars. So by saying we need to get to, like Elon Musk here brings up, he believes that humans are stuck on Earth, which she clearly is against. But she says it's kind of like taking away from our own responsibility. But these people do believe that Earth is becoming like Mars due to all this climate change and everything. So Mars must go to the way of Earth, and that can be done through terraforming. So then she talks about the wilding of Mars. So basically she was asked to create a project for the Moving to Mars exhibition that addressed her view of Mars colonization by humans. And that's when she created the wilding of Mars, and she chose to portray colonization, but she took the route of cultivating crops on the surface of Mars rather than human colonization. And the project is created through a computer game engine called Unity, which the user can actually watch the plants growing and spreading across the terrain. And she talks about how this challenges the idea that space colonization might not result in human benefit. And so it was really strange to me to see how, because when reading this, I thought the whole purpose of putting crops on Earth was just to make the atmosphere more like Earth. But she says that's not actually the point of this. It's just to show that there can be other life that take over Mars that isn't humans. And it's because of her great belief that space colonization is actually devastating and not progressive. And it's funny to me how he keeps coming up, but she talks about Elon Musk again and how he proposes 1 million humans on Mars by 2060. And she thinks about all the issues that we created on Earth that will once again repeat on Mars, like social hierarchies and prisons. And when speaking of colonizing Mars, there's no reference to the terrible legacy of colonial actions on Earth, like imperialism, genocide, resource exploitation, which she's against, and that's what this project is meant to show. So then she brings up the idea that was talked about in the introduction, and that's that there might be life on Mars, and this is just another reason why we should avoid colonizing. And she brings up the 1967 International Outer Space Treaty, which we agreed to avoid harmful contamination of other planets. But private interests, such as Elon Musk's SpaceX program, are racing to be the first on Mars, and this is worrying. So her project, the Wilding of Mars, is meant to show that through this colonization, there can be so many different versions of Mars, and our own version of Mars through human colonization could mirror the social and environmental injustices on Earth. So lastly, the author brings up the idea of a heterotopia, which that's what Mars is, in relation to her project, the Wilding of Mars. And that's a place that's neither better nor worse, but just different. And that might just worry us as humans because we're not used to looking at things as different, but we look at things as a utopia or a dystopia in the future. And that's kind of how we are viewing Mars traditionally, like, oh, the future of Mars, we're going to live on Mars, it's going to be a utopia, there's going to be more space, we're going to have new designs. But she's saying we shouldn't only look at that as the only two options, but this heterotopia allows us to reimagine Mars as a place for life other than ourselves. And I think this image that I have here kind of shows what a heterotopia might look like. And this is a picture that I found from the website Future Architect Platform. And it kind of shows like how somebody's reimagining architecture just differently, and how because of this new way we're going in the ideas of like traveling to Mars, colonizing Mars, we should as designers look at our designs as sort of a heterotopia too, because we're creating designs that just basically have never been done for and have to accommodate for so many different things that we just simply never experienced. And whether we do go the route of colonizing through plants or we as humans colonize, there's so many design implications that we have to take into account. So my questions for the readings are: do we have a responsibility to mitigate climate change through our designs? Do you think it is necessary for space design to be familiar, or should it be primarily utilitarian? And how should the idea of a future heterotopia play into design? Thank you.